I'm Clara Nightwell, and I'm here with Rowan Hartsteele. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the darkest moments in American history.
The American Civil War was not just a conflict between armies. It was a nation turning against itself, families divided, states separated, and identity fractured.
A war that almost destroyed the United States before it fully became one.
More Americans died in the Civil War than in any other war the country has ever fought. It tested the meaning of freedom, the limits of democracy, and whether a divided republic could survive at all.
And at the center of that storm was one man.
Abraham Lincoln, a president facing an impossible question: could a nation built on liberty survive while denying it to millions?
Tonight, we'll explore how a single war nearly broke a country, and how Lincoln tried to hold it together. Rowan, before the war began, what was happening inside the United States that made conflict almost inevitable?
By the mid-19th century, the United States was a single country on paper, but in reality, it had become two worlds living under one flag. The North and the South had grown apart economically, culturally, and morally. The northern states were industrializing rapidly. Cities expanded, factories multiplied, and immigration transformed society. Labor, though harsh, was paid. Progress was associated with movement, invention, and social change. The southern states followed a very different model. Their economy depended heavily on agriculture, especially cotton, and that system relied almost entirely on enslaved labor. Slavery was not a side issue. It was the foundation of Southern wealth, politics, and identity. As the nation expanded westward, a single question followed every new territory: would it allow slavery or not? Each decision threatened to upset the balance of power in Congress. Compromises were attempted again and again. Laws were written, rewritten, and broken. Temporary peace masked permanent tension. But beyond politics, something deeper was happening. Americans no longer agreed on what their country stood for. Was the United States a union that could not be broken, or a voluntary agreement states could abandon? For many in the South, states' rights mattered more than federal authority. For many in the North, the Union itself had become sacred.
So it wasn't only about slavery, it was about the meaning of the nation itself.
Exactly. Slavery was the moral wound, but the argument spread into every corner of national life. Two visions of America emerged, one rooted in permanence, the other in autonomy. By the time Abraham Lincoln entered the political stage, compromise was no longer healing the fracture, it was merely delaying the collapse. The country was standing on the edge of a war it could feel coming, but could no longer stop.
Rowan, in the middle of all this tension, who was Abraham Lincoln before he became president?
Abraham Lincoln did not come from power. He came from scarcity. Born in a log cabin on the American frontier, his early life was marked by loss, hard labor, and constant movement. Formal education was rare for him. Most of what he learned came from books borrowed, reread, and memorized by candlelight. He grew up watching inequality, not as theory, but as daily reality. Poverty shaped his character. It taught him restraint, empathy, and an unusual sensitivity to suffering, qualities that would later define his leadership. Lincoln entered politics slowly. He was not charismatic in the traditional sense. He spoke plainly. He looked awkward. But he possessed something rare, moral clarity combined with patience. He opposed the expansion of slavery, not initially as a radical abolitionist, but as a man who believed the nation could not endure half free and half enslaved.
So he wasn't trying to provoke the South.
No. In fact, Lincoln feared war. He understood the cost before it arrived, but he also believed that allowing slavery to expand would betray the country's founding principles. His speeches reflected that tension. He spoke of unity while warning of division. He tried to slow the collapse, even as it accelerated around him. When Lincoln was elected president in 1860, he did not inherit peace. He inherited a countdown.
Rowan, once Lincoln was elected, how quickly did the country begin to fall apart?
The collapse was immediate. Even before Lincoln took office, several southern states began to secede from the Union. They did not wait to see what he would do. His election alone was interpreted as a threat to their way of life. One by one, states declared separation. They formed a new government, the Confederate States of America, claiming the right to leave a union they believed no longer protected their interests. This was unprecedented. The Constitution had never clearly answered whether a state could secede. The nation faced a terrifying question. Was the United States a permanent union, or merely a temporary agreement? For Lincoln, the answer was clear. If secession were allowed, democracy itself would fail. Any election could be overturned by refusal.
So holding the Union together became his priority.
Yes, even before emancipation, Lincoln believed that preserving the Union was essential. Without it, no law, no constitution, and no moral promise could survive. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the conflict turned irreversible. What had been political tension became open war. At first, many believed the war would be short. Both sides underestimated the scale of what was coming. Young men volunteered with enthusiasm, unaware they were stepping into the bloodiest conflict in American history. The nation had crossed a line, and there would be no return without unimaginable cost.
Rowan, once the war had begun, did Lincoln realize how devastating it would become?
Very quickly, Lincoln understood that this war would not be brief. The early battles shattered every illusion. What many believed would last weeks turned into months, then years. The Union Army suffered humiliating defeats in the beginning. Generals hesitated, strategies failed, public confidence wavered, and criticism toward Lincoln intensified. Lincoln was blamed for nearly everything. Newspapers mocked him. Political rivals questioned his intelligence. Families grieving lost sons demanded answers. At the same time, he carried the unbearable weight of decision-making. Every order sent men to die. Every delay cost lives.
That kind of responsibility must have been isolating.
It was. Lincoln often worked late into the night, reading casualty reports by lamplight. Visitors described him as deeply saddened, yet composed. He carried personal grief as well. The death of his young son during the war left scars that never healed. Despite mounting pressure, Lincoln refused to abandon the Union cause. He replaced generals, adjusted strategy, and searched relentlessly for leadership capable of ending the conflict. Slowly, painfully, the war became not just a military struggle, but a moral one. By the second year of war, Lincoln understood something terrifying. Victory alone would not be enough. The meaning of the war itself had to change.
Rowan, you said the meaning of the war had to change. What brought Lincoln to that realization?
As the war dragged on, Lincoln began to understand a painful truth. Restoring the Union as it once was would not be enough. Too much blood had been spilled. Too many lives had been lost. The nation needed a reason that justified the sacrifice. Slavery, which had always haunted the conflict, could no longer remain in the background. It had shaped the economy, the politics, and the moral contradiction at the heart of the country. Lincoln did not act impulsively. He understood the political danger of emancipation. Freeing enslaved people could alienate border states still loyal to the Union. It could fracture fragile alliances and deepen hatred. Yet doing nothing meant accepting that the war had no higher purpose.
So emancipation was both moral and strategic.
Exactly! Lincoln waited for the right moment. Not victory, but momentum. After the Battle of Antietam, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that enslaved people in Confederate-held territory would be free. It did not end slavery everywhere immediately, but it transformed the war's meaning forever. From that moment on, the Civil War was no longer only about preserving a nation. It was about redefining it. The Union Army became an army of liberation. Thousands of formerly enslaved men joined its ranks, fighting not only for the country, but for their own humanity. With emancipation, Lincoln bound the fate of the Union to the promise of freedom. There would be no return to the old world.
Rowan, emancipation changed the meaning of the war, but how did the country react to that decision?
The reaction was immediate and deeply divided. For many in the North, emancipation was a moral awakening, long overdue and necessary. For others, it was a betrayal. Soldiers who believed they were fighting only to preserve the Union now realized they were fighting to end slavery. Some welcomed that purpose. Others resented it. In the South, the proclamation hardened resistance. The war was no longer political. It became existential. Meanwhile, in northern cities, protests erupted. Draft riots exposed racial tension even among those opposed to slavery. Lincoln stood at the center of a nation that was angry in every direction.
So even doing the right thing came at an enormous cost.
Yes, emancipation did not unite the country, it tested it further. But it also clarified something essential. The war now stood for something greater than territory. As black soldiers joined the Union Army, the conflict gained a human face that could no longer be ignored. Their courage, sacrifice, and discipline reshaped public perception. Lincoln absorbed criticism with remarkable restraint. He wrote letters explaining his reasoning. He listened to opposing voices. Yet he never retreated from the decision. He understood that leadership sometimes meant choosing the path that guarantees pain, because the alternative guarantees injustice. Freedom, once declared, could no longer be undone, even if the nation was not ready for it.
Rowan, as the war continued, how did Lincoln endure the final years of such constant suffering?
By the final years of the Civil War, the weight on Lincoln was almost unbearable. The conflict had consumed the nation, and its cost was written everywhere, in hospitals, letters, graveyards, and broken families. Lincoln aged visibly. Photographs from the period show a man transformed. His face grew hollow. His eyes carried exhaustion that no speech could hide. Every day, Lincoln received reports listing thousands of casualties. He often visited wounded soldiers, speaking quietly, listening more than he talked. He refused to distance himself from suffering. He believed leadership required presence, even when presence hurt.
That kind of closeness must have taken a tremendous personal toll.
It did. Lincoln battled deep melancholy throughout his life, and the war intensified it. Yet he continued to work relentlessly, often late into the night. Despite criticism and despair, he refused bitterness. Instead of vengeance, he spoke increasingly of reconciliation. As Union victories finally began to appear, Lincoln did not celebrate triumph. He understood that winning the war would be easier than healing the nation. His vision turned toward rebuilding, not punishing. The South. Even before peace arrived, Lincoln was already thinking about forgiveness.
Rowan, as victory finally came into sight, how did Lincoln speak to a nation exhausted by war?
As the end of the war approached, Lincoln chose words carefully, not as a conqueror, but as a healer. He understood that the nation was not simply broken politically, but emotionally. In his speeches, especially toward the end, his tone softened. There was no triumph, no humiliation of the defeated. Instead, he spoke of shared suffering. His second inaugural address captured this spirit. Rather than celebrating victory, Lincoln reflected on the moral cost of slavery and the judgment history would pass on the entire nation. He famously urged Americans to act with malice toward none, with charity for all. It was a call not for forgetting, but for rebuilding together.
That must have been difficult to hear for a country full of grief.
It was. Many wanted punishment, many wanted revenge, but Lincoln believed that bitterness would only extend the war into peace. For him, reconciliation was not weakness, it was necessity. If the Union was to survive, it had to become more than a victory. It had to become a promise. When Confederate armies finally surrendered, the country stood at the edge of something fragile. Peace had arrived, but healing had not. Lincoln prepared plans for reconstruction based on mercy, reintegration, and shared responsibility. In victory, Lincoln chose compassion, a decision that would soon cost him everything.
Rowan, the war was finally over. What happened next shocked the entire nation.
The end of the Civil War brought relief, but not peace. The United States in 1865 was a wounded country. Cities celebrated victory while families mourned in silence. Nearly every household had lost someone. The nation was unified on paper, but fractured in spirit. Slavery had been defeated, yet freedom itself was still undefined. Millions of formerly enslaved people stood at the edge of a new life without land, protection, or clear rights. The future was uncertain for everyone. Politically, the country stood at a crossroads. Radical voices demanded punishment for the South. Others feared that harsh measures would ignite new conflict. Lincoln envisioned Reconstruction as healing, bringing former Confederate states back into the Union quickly, with loyalty rather than humiliation.
So the war may have ended, but the hardest work was just beginning.
Exactly. And it was during this fragile moment, when the nation was most vulnerable, that tragedy struck. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington. The war had ended days earlier. For the first time in years, the president allowed himself a moment of rest. John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer, saw Lincoln as a tyrant. Driven by rage, ideology, and delusion, he believed violence could reverse history. When he fired the fatal shot, it was not only an attack on a man, it was an attack on reconciliation itself. Lincoln died the following morning, and in that instant, the nation fell silent.
Rowan, how did the country respond to Lincoln's death?
The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News of Lincoln's assassination spread across the nation like a shockwave. Church bells rang in mourning, businesses closed, cities fell silent. For many Americans, Lincoln's death felt personal. He had become the face of endurance during the darkest years of the war. People who had never met him wept openly, as if they had lost a member of their own family. His funeral procession traveled through multiple cities, allowing millions to pay their respects. Crowds gathered along railways and streets, standing quietly as the train passed. It was one of the largest public mourning events in American history.
It sounds like the nation was grieving more than a president.
It was grieving a possibility. Lincoln represented the hope that reconciliation could be gentle, that healing could happen without revenge. With his death, that future felt uncertain. The country feared what would come next, and whether mercy would survive without him. Over time, Lincoln's image transformed. The flawed, exhausted man faded into memory, replaced by the symbol, the great emancipator, the martyr of the Union. Yet behind the monument stood a human being who doubted, suffered, and endured. Lincoln's legacy lives not because he was perfect, but because he chose unity when division felt easier.
Before we close tonight, I'd like to bring Margaret into the conversation. Margaret, if someone wants to understand Abraham Lincoln beyond the monument, where should they begin?
A wonderful place to start is Lincoln by David Herbert Donald. It's a deeply balanced biography. It doesn't idealize him, and it doesn't diminish him either. It allows readers to meet Lincoln as a man shaped by doubt, loss, and responsibility.
So it's more about understanding him than admiring him.
Exactly. And once you understand him, admiration tends to grow naturally, not because he was flawless, but because he endured.
And what about his leadership during the war itself?
Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin explores that beautifully. It shows how Lincoln surrounded himself with political opponents and turned disagreement into strength. It's one of the finest studies of leadership under pressure.
That feels very relevant even today.
Very much so. It reminds us that unity doesn't require sameness. It requires listening.
And if someone wants to understand the moral heart of the conflict?
The Fiery Trial by Eric Foner focuses precisely on that. It follows Lincoln's evolving relationship with slavery and shows how his views deepened as the war unfolded. It's not a story of instant clarity, but of moral growth.
3 perspectives: the man, the leader, and the moral journey.
Together, they offer a fuller understanding of who Lincoln truly was.
Thank you, Margaret. As always, that was beautifully explained.
It's always a pleasure, Clara.
All right, let's return to Rowan. Rowan, after everything we've talked about tonight, how would you describe Lincoln's legacy beyond the United States?
Lincoln's impact reached far beyond American borders. His struggle wasn't only about preserving a nation, it was about proving that democracy could survive internal collapse. In a world shaped by revolutions, empires, and fragile republics, his leadership became a reference point for political thinkers across Europe and the Americas, much like the ideals that emerged during the French Revolution, which we explored in a previous episode. Lincoln's era forced humanity to confront the same question: can liberty exist without equality? Different countries answered differently, but the question itself became universal. His legacy reminds us that freedom is not born complete. It is shaped through conflict, doubt, and sacrifice, and sometimes through unbearable loss.
Thank you, Rowan. And thank you for listening with us tonight. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. And if these stories speak to you, stay with us. There's much more waiting for you here.